Yellowstone supervolcano's quiet power. The ground movements of huge hotspot are greater than thought. Even though it's slumbering, it's still moving. A 17-year University of Utah study of ground movements shows that the power of the huge volcanic hotspot beneath Yellowstone National Park is much greater than previously thought during times when the giant volcano is sleeping. It's slumbering. It's a $2.3 million study which used Global Positioning Systems GPS satellites. They measured horizontal and vertical motions of the Earth's crust from 1987 to 2004 and found that the gigantic underground plume of molten rock known as the Yellowstone hotspot exerts itself forcefully even though it is not triggering eruptions and earthquakes. It's still forcefully exerting. As it bulges upward, the hotspot expends 10 times more energy by gradually deforming the Earth's crust at Yellowstone than by producing earthquakes. The subterranean volcano plume, 300 miles wide at its top end, may explain why ground along the Teton Fault moves in directions just the opposite of those expected, a perplexing discovery that complicates efforts to predict when the fault might generate a disastrous 7.5 earthquake near the ski resorts of Jackson Hole. Molten rock and hot water generated by the hotspot continue to make up the 45 by 30 mile Yellowstone caldera, a giant crater huff up and huff downwards, in other words, Yellowstone breathing, without producing eruptions. Measurements since the newly published study ended in 2004. It showed the caldera rising upward at a faster rate than ever observed before. Please support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below. The Yellowstone hotspot has had a much bigger effect over the larger area with more energy than ever expected, said University of Utah geophysicist Professor Robert Smith. He led the study, which was scheduled for publication, and he said, we're seeing large-scale deformation of the Earth's crust in the western United States because of the effects of the Yellowstone hotspot. The study was conducted by Puska Smith, University of Utah postdoctorate fellow Wu Lung Chang, and former Utah researcher Chuck Meertens at UNAVCO, a consortium that studies deformation of the Earth's crust. Measurements also were made by the National Park Service's U.S. Geological Survey, Idaho National Laboratory, Brigham Young University, MIT, and the National Geodetic Survey. Smith estimated the participants spent about $2.3 million for the 17 years of these measurements. The new study, based on measurements made from 1987 to 2004, the measurements included 17 1- to 3-month-long campaigns, during which portable GPS receivers were placed for 2 to 10 days each at 90 to 140 benchmarks in the Yellowstone, Teton, Eastern Snake River Plain region of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. More data came from 15 permanent GPS receiver sites. They were installed from between 1996 and 2003. And the GPS allows, of course, precise surveys of ground movements because 24 Navstar GPS satellites orbiting the Earth broadcast time signals. GPS receivers on the ground record the signals, making it possible to triangulate each receiver's location to within a few tenths of an inch horizontally and vertically. Restless volcanic caldera huffs and puffs. The study summarizes the movements of the floor of the 45 by 30 mile Yellowstone caldera, a gigantic volcano crater formed by the catastrophic eruption 642,000 years ago that spread volcanic ash over half of North America and was 1,000 times bigger than the 1980 Mount St. Helens volcano eruption in Washington state. Other huge Yellowstone eruptions happened 1.3 million years ago, 2 million years ago, and the latest one 640,000 years ago, and 30 much smaller but still large eruptions between and since the 3 cataclysmic blasts. Now, due to underground movements of molten rock and hot water, calderas often have 30 cataclysmic since the 640,000 year eruption. Now, that's the first time I've ever heard that. Now, due to underground movement of molten rock and hot water, calderas often huff and puff downwards for tens of thousands of years without catastrophic eruptions. Earlier research found that a flattened chamber of partly molten rock extends from about 5 miles beneath the Yellowstone caldera down to a depth of at least 10 miles, heated by the much larger underground hotspot. The 50-mile wide hotspot plume of molten rock originates at least 410 miles underground in Earth's mantle and rises to 75 miles below the caldera, where it hits cooler rock and spreads out to a width of 300 miles. Conventional surveying of Yellowstone began in 1923. Measurements showed the caldera floor rose 40 inches during 1923 to 1984, then fell 8 inches during 1985 to 1995. The GPS data show the Yellowstone caldera floor sank 4.4 inches during 1987 to 1995. From 1995 to 2000, the caldera rose again, but the uplift was greatest, 3 inches at North Geyser Basin, just outside the caldera's northwest rim. During 2000-2003, the northwest area rose another 1.4 inches, but the caldera floor sank 1.1 inches. Smith and Puskas believe the caldera sank when hot water, steam, and gases migrated northward out of the caldera into the North Geyser Basin area, making that area rise. While not part of the new published study, Smith reported at an American Geophysical Union meeting, the GPS measurements showed the northwest caldera area sank by 3.2 inches, but the central caldera floor rose faster than ever recorded, about 6.7 inches since mid-2004. The rate is unprecedented, at least in terms of what scientists have been able to observe in Yellowstone, Smith says. He says, we think it's a combination of magma, molten rock being intruded under the caldera, and hot water released from the magma being pressurized because it's trapped. I don't believe, he says, this is evidence of an impending volcanic eruption, but it would be prudent to keep monitoring the volcano. Puskas adds, this episode may represent a period like those observed at other large volcanic systems, such as Long Valley Caldera in California, where episodes of unrest have lasted 1 to 4 years, with uplift rates as high as 4 inches a year. The fact some GPS receivers now are permanently installed in Yellowstone and provide data daily made researchers realize that ups and downs of the caldera occur not just in decades or years, but in months, reflecting underground movements of molten rock and hot water that also happen over months. Hotspot's bulge may explain a new mystery on the Teton Fault. The Yellowstone hotspot made overlying region bulge upward by 1/3 mile during the past 2 million years, lifting the Yellowstone Plateau to 8,000 feet elevation. Smith and Puskas say the 1987 to 2004 GPS measurements show the southwest part of Yellowstone Plateau is slowly sliding downhill to the southwest at about 1/6 inch per year. That may explain the study's biggest surprise. Ground along the Teton Fault moves opposite the expected direction. The fault runs 40 miles north-south along the eastern base of the Teton Range. It's a normal fault, which means that during large quakes, the mountains rise upwards and move westward, while the valley of Jackson Hole, just east of the mountains, drops downwards and moves eastward. That's because the Teton region is part of the Basin and Range province of the West, where Earth's crust is pulled apart east-west between the Sierra Nevada in California and the Rocky Mountains in Utah, Wyoming, and Montana. The vertical movement totals about 3 to 6 feet during a single magnitude 7 quake. Previous evidence indicates there were thousands of magnitude 7 to 7.5 earthquakes during the past 13 million years, lifting the tallest Teton peaks to altitude of more than 13,000 feet, almost 7,000 feet above Jackson Hole. Such a quake today would be a major disaster for Jackson, Wyoming, and nearby towns, obviously. Yet 17 years of GPS measurements show the textbook model for a normal fault is not what happened at the Teton Fault. Smith says the mountains are going down relatively to the valley going up. That's a total surprise, he said. The results? Jackson Hole moved west 1/4 inch and upwards 1.7 inches from 1987 to 2004, meaning the Teton Range and Jackson Hole Valley are being squeezed together rather than stretched apart, as was expected. Smith believes that bulging Yellowstone hotspot, located north of the Tetons, may be pushing Jackson Hole into the Teton Range. This unexpected pressure may explain why there have been no magnitude 7 earthquakes on the fault since the last one about 4,800 years ago, yet also may allow pressure to build for the next disastrous earthquake. Smith says, the question is, how do you store the stress that is leading to the next big earthquake? It might include episodes of compression and stretching, and eventually the dominant basin and range stretching prevails to trigger a big earthquake. Slow deformation overpowers quick earthquakes. During the new study, Pushkas converted GPS-measured ground movements and records of historic earthquake magnitudes into a quantity known as moment, which measures the energy expended to deform the landscape. That allowed her to compare total ground deformation measurements by GPS with ground deformation caused by earthquakes. She found the ground-moving energy of Yellowstone's frequent, mostly small quakes was overpowered 10-1 by the energy generated from other ground-moving forces. Those include the Yellowstone hotspot's bulging uplift of the landscape, smaller volcanic ups and downs within the caldera, relaxation of the ground after quakes, and basin and range stretching of earth crust that ultimately will generate future quakes. Smith says the fact non-seismic forces to overwhelm quake energies by 10-1 means that there is much more energy related to active volcanic pressures, processes of uplift and extension of the Earth's surface, he says. An example, the southwestern Yellowstone Plateau is moving southwest at 1/6 inch per year, twice as fast as the next block of land to the southwest. The eastern Snake River Plain, land from Island Park, Idaho, southwest to Idaho Falls is being squeezed by the collision. Smith says that represents a lot of energy in a small area because the entire 600-mile wide basin and range province between the Sierra and the Rockies is stretching apart only 3 times faster, or about 1/2 inch per year. This is by University of Utah on phys.org. Please leave your comments and thank you for your support.